It's hard to imagine an event that would define the careers of procurement and supply chain professionals worldwide more than a global pandemic. Yet at the start of the decade, that's exactly what we have. The coronavirus has brought not just our supply chains, but our world as we know it to a grinding halt. Yet from the perspective of the C-suite and our shareholders, business must go on. And we're the ones responsible for making sure it happens. So we want to help you crowdsource confidence during the coronavirus crisis. Procurious's COVID-19 supply chain crisis webinars have been designed to give you the emotional and the technical support you need while the chips are down. Today we want to focus on a huge category of spend, outsourced services, but also your own procurement team. We want to take a critical look at both of these areas of spend, take a quick history trip to understand why we're here, and now what we can do to quickly triage the situation. We also want to finish off today's discussion with sharing some very practical tips to set ourselves up for very strong recovery when we're on the other side of this crisis. Today we've invited the executives from Everest Group. We have three amazing speakers joining us today. Amy Fong, Vice President, Strategic Outsourcing and Vendor Management, Michael Jansen, Chief Research Officer, and Abhishek Singh, Vice President, IT Services. So let's start by looking at the current situation. We can look at the life cycle of a pandemic crisis and think about it as a cycle, even though this wasn't something we were looking at even 4 weeks ago. And even though this looks very much like a business chart, I wanted to talk about the human side of this pandemic before we get into today's topic. Let's be human. Let's share our current experiences. All our speakers today are based in the US, but three very different regions. For our global listeners, it would be great if you could share what it's like there and on the ground. Let's start with you, Abhishek. I was shocked to wake up yesterday and learn that there are now more than 25,000 cases of coronavirus in New York. And that number is expected to treble in the next few days. What a shock for us in the world. Now, I know you're based in New Jersey. What's the sentiment?
Well, the sentiment is not very different from what exists all across the world. We are all concerned, logged in. And the message that I have for you from my side is we are following guidelines. We are following science. And we are doing whatever we can to protect ourselves and also ensure that we are keeping an eye on the ball, continue to work wherever we are. So that's my perspective.
Okay, and let's move a bit further west then to Texas. Michael, the other day you told me that you walked down your drive down to the road to chat with your neighbours, and you were having to do that with the social distancing rules in place, of course. When's the last time you did that? Is it really giving us cause to slow down? How are things in Texas?
Well, I'd say we're kind of somewhere in between the coast in terms of the overall perspective. Not nearly the same impact here. People are concerned, but the level of actual cases is much lower than we see on the East Coast and the West Coast. And so I think people are still kind of wait and see. They are trying to be cautious, but at the same time, we're still also trying to keep life as normal as best as possible. So I think people are taking their walks, but they're also, working from home and trying to make the best of it where they can.
Yeah, and what about you, Amy? I mean, I know you and I spoke a wee while ago, and you were saying that the schools were closing, and you were working from home. How are things with you now? What's happening over on the West Coast?
Sure. So I'm in San Francisco, California, and our area, the Bay Area, was actually one of the first to go to a shelter in place. So we've been in that state for about a week and a half now, or maybe it's a little over a week. The days start to blend together at this when you're not leaving the house. We have some pretty limited reasons for going out. We are allowed to have outdoor activity, but schools are shut down. Everything's down. People take the social distancing very, very seriously. Lots of outrage if someone steps in your 6-foot bubble. So it's a really interesting time. I think what we're seeing is that the numbers are at the state level or city level are looking like we might be flattening the curve a little bit, and that's pretty rewarding given the compromises we've had to make. So,
well, that's encouraging news, because I think that's been a hard challenge for us here in the UK, is about the social distancing, getting people to stay at home. And if the evidence starts to show that the curves are flattening, that can inspire other people to stay at home and take action. Okay, now moving on from your own situations to the global networks that we're all connected with and you're connected with, what are you hearing and learning from your colleagues and your connections about some of the supply chain challenges that people are facing? Amy, what are you hearing yourself?
Yeah, I think procurement, we all know, is in a really interesting position right now, kind of a chance to step up in a good way. But what I see among my network is a lot of people who are having to source some things really quickly, finding masks for their businesses, for their employees, or other kinds of materials that they don't normally source. So there's a lot of immediate connecting online, but there's also a lot of I don't want to use the word panic, but concern about what we're having to do to keep the supply chain running.
And are you finding that there's people are patient around that? One of the things that you do see is people getting frustrated that supplies aren't there instantaneously. Are the colleagues you're speaking to encountering that people are wanting things and they're wanting them now and yesterday, and that's just not possible, humanly possible at the moment?
I think I see two different views. On the outside world, I see really high expectations for companies to step up and help right now. What I think many outside of supply chain don't see is the people that are stepping up and helping each other and saying, look, we've got this stock of masks in our stock room. Can we pass that over to a hospital? Or, some of the logistics companies stepping up to help out. So I actually think there's a lot going on behind the scenes that the average person isn't seeing, that, supply chain people, procurement are really trying to shift into action where they can. So I find that a little bit heartwarming, although still, quite a bit of pressure for our profession.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that, because I think it's a good thing for people to hear out there that we are all helping each other. Michael, what about you? What are you hearing from your network?
So I think there's a real industry-specific views that you got to think about here. We're talking to clients, and in some cases, their volumes are skyrocketing. So if you have a call center or you have a delivery business, Amazon right now is just, they're overcome with demand. And so if you were in one of the particular businesses, healthcare would be another one, you may be seeing your volumes go through the roof, whereas in other industries, we're seeing substantial decreases in things like travel and hospitality. And so what we are thinking about that, if that's the demand side, then where do we see on the supply side from a overall services perspective? And that's where we start to think about places like where these big service centers are at. So maybe the Philippines or India, where a lot of those calls and a lot of the transactions actually get processed around the world. And so we are starting to see that as India becomes more and more impacted, we are starting to hear stories about some challenges there. And so I think that's the thing that we're going to be watching over the next couple of weeks is how big does this become from a services perspective? How big does the issue become in terms of ability to deliver? And that's going to be an evolving situation. And I think companies are going to have to make sacrifices in their service levels and adjustments to what their expectation is of what's possible.
Absolutely. And, there is perhaps a perception that when things are like call centers, that's something that can easily shift to a home-based location, that might not be as easy, as we think in terms of people's connectivity and what facilities they've got at home. Abhishek, what about you? What are you hearing yourself from your network?
Sure. Let me talk about it by sharing a live example. Yesterday, I was doing a webinar on the very same topic, and in came a flash that India had locked down for 21 days completely. Now, if you're thinking about that news from a services supply chain perspective, that was huge. I was in the midst of talking about how laptop shortages are impairing the ability of service providers to be delivering work in situations wherein they are mandated to do so. And suddenly that entire message hit home because everybody is now mandated to work from home, except for certain exceptions that have been provided. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that this is indeed a black swan event that we are facing. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, although we have some sense of what has panned out in other geographies, China, South Korea, or Italy. But we are kind of planning day by day and thinking about how to ensure that business continuity, service continuity from a supply chain perspective continues to happen.
Okay, so really playing to that whole piece about adaptability and really just trying to keep all the antennae open to see what's going to happen next. Okay, we've covered off the human side of the pandemic and talked about what we're hearing from our networks. Let's get a little bit more granular. Michael, we've got your curve up on the screen there, your chart. Where do you think we are in the life cycle of the pandemic curve?
Yeah, so let me just kind of walk through the curve as we see it. And this is really kind of thinking about this in the context of the overall macro picture, and then how do we apply it into the services industry. And so, you know, I think we all knew about this pandemic, or we knew at the time, we knew it was a virus, and it was a pretty serious virus, but it was in China. And I think most of us were kind of, hey, yeah, it's somebody else's problem, not something we really got to worry about today. And we were going through our lives. But as it's evolved, the reality set in is that, you know, hey, oh my God, it's here. And I think the first reaction from people was to go out and buy toilet paper. I don't necessarily understand why, but that was the first reaction. And we're still, at least here in Texas, we're still looking for toilet paper on the shelves, but I'm told it's coming back. I think also that our next challenge is going to be, and again, it depends on where you're at in the world, is it almost doesn't feel real. Spring is here, and it's fantastic to go outside, and people are going to be impatient for this, and maybe it's somebody else's problem. But I think beyond that, it is going to hit home. I think there's inevitably all parts of the world are going to be impacted by it. And I think eventually most people will know somebody that was impacted, and hopefully not in the most severe cases, but you probably will know somebody that's had a very serious incident. But beyond that, we're going to learn to live again. And that's the part I always want to focus people's attention on, is this won't go on forever. We've been through this before. It's just we've got, you know, hyper awareness of what's going on right now, but we are going to learn to live a little differently going forward. And then we're going to want to get back to work. I think we're all, as human beings, enthused about the passions of our careers, and we're going to find ways to get back to work. And we may think about it differently. And then ultimately, from a company standpoint, we are going to be looking for a new and improved normal. And so I think that's where, when I talk to senior executives, I keep people focused on, yes, we're dealing with the immediate time today, but, you know, never let a good crisis create some opportunities for us. It's kind of the old saying there. And so we want to create that opportunity in the conversations. Now, if I put countries on here, certainly China is on the right-hand side of this chart. As we record this, I think Italy is kind of toward that bottom. They've had the ultimate time that's impacting home, and then ultimately, I think U.S. is actually somewhere on the left side, moving toward the bottom here of this curve. So again, it's going to vary. You know, hopefully it is a one-way journey on the curve. Hopefully we don't have to regress backwards, but I think, you know, we're all going to have to go through this kind of perspective in some form or fashion.
Yes, and we heard on the webinar last week that China was in the process of going back to work, and that was going to start in the next week or so. So that does give us a perspective to try to look forward. Okay, so today we want to help our procurement and supply chain community understand how they can triage or diagnose the stability of their outsourced offshore service providers. But for those of you who've joined us on today's conversation to learn about the outsourced services category, why don't we get the experts from Everest Group to give us a little 101, a bit of context on outsourced offshore services contracts to start with. Michael, can you give us a brief history of outsourcing? Remind us all why some of our services are offshore, which services are predominantly outsourced by large companies, why, and also to where.
Okay, so I've been part of the outsourcing industry for my entire career, so we're talking 3+ decades, and it has always been about creation of value for clients. Now, typically, the first value creation point is cost savings, but there's almost always a level of expertise, whether it be a systems expertise or a process expertise or an industry expertise that gets layered in. Ultimately, there's also a scale factor. So the scale factor that outsourcers create by getting into an industry and getting really good at it and having the ability to hone their craft, if you will, in given processes or systems. What got this in, what a big turn in this industry is, as I look back to my history, was the Y2K and the proof of concept that India afforded us. And so my first trip to India was in just after Y2K, and it was an absolute eye-opening experience for myself in terms of realizing that the potential for a tremendous cost savings and tremendous scale was there. And so as I look back on that, that was just the beginning. And yes, there were some starts and stops to it and many different locations beyond India, but India and the Philippines being the predominant scale opportunities. We've had tremendous learnings and we've had some failures, but mostly on the upside. And while there certainly is a lot of labor savings there for that, it has really evolved into an expertise opportunity as well for both insourcing and outsourcing. Now, I mentioned India as being the largest location, the Philippines, but you can also look to a lot of the Eastern European countries. You can look to some of the South American countries as well. Now, regarding the processes that went, the first one that was the biggest and still is probably the most prevalent was the IT processes. So the development and the maintenance of our IT systems was a big part of that. And then you can also look at a lot of the business processes. And so you get some of the back office items, call centers, transaction processing. Those became big opportunities for cost savings at scale. And so that's where people really looked at it and say, hey, we need to be competitive on a global basis. And if we don't do a look at these low cost locations, we're not taking advantage of what's available in the global market for our shareholders.
What sort of situation do we have? Abhishek, what's the current and imminent impact of supply on customers then, on our listeners today of these geolocations?
Sure. So think of all the services sitting here in the United States that you're accessing by way of technology. You're logging into a banking app. You're probably accessing an e-commerce website. You're probably calling into a hospital to check on certain symptoms that you have. Chances are 80% of the time, either the app that you are accessing or the website that you're logging into or the phone call that you're making, those are getting routed or are getting supported by people sitting out of services locations such as India and Philippines. Now, as I was talking through the examples of the lockdown that has taken place, how people are constrained in being able to work from home or even work from offices, imagine how these things could work. Sitting at home, locked down myself in New Jersey, that's my only way to kind of get access to the things that I need. And we are talking about over 300 million people in the United States. I'm just taking example of companies which would be serving those. So the impact from a perspective of potential is huge. The service providers are taking multiple actions to ensure that service continuity takes place. But right at this point in time, everybody is actioning their business continuity plans.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that, because that's, I think, given us a real insight into outsourcing, where the main centres are based for these services to be provided, and also then a bit of a feel there at the end for what the impact could possibly be because of the pandemic. Okay, let's move on then to triage then. So what should we all be focusing on right now if we've got these outsourced services within our portfolio of contracts that we've got there? Abhishek, let's start with services. How do we triage our service providers?
Sure. So before I jump into the triaging aspect, let me just repeat what I started off saying when you had asked me the question around the impact. The fact is, we are in a black swan event. Nobody, neither the enterprises nor the service providers were prepared for an event of this magnitude. So everybody is planning on their feet right now. And that is why my first point here is that we need to be aware of variances in preparedness that you will see as enterprises across your service provider portfolio. And that is why you'll need to spend a lot of time triaging between your different service providers, your procurement, and other aspects of your business to ensure that your business and service continuity continues to happen. Now, things such as where you get your services from, and I was just making this point around how the impact of lockdown in India or something that is happening in Philippines ends up impacting something like your internet banking access or your e-commerce call center access, something like that. So knowing and understanding what your service provider's location risks are, where are they working out of, will give you a good hang of how prepared your service providers are. And last but not the least, this entire aspect of your service provider's resources getting stretched. Just as we are hearing of doctors triaging on which patient to treat first, even your service providers will be triaging on which customers to prioritize. Believe me, they also work for hundreds of other customers, and they will also be prioritizing. Hence, you need to be watching out for how you will prepare for such an eventuality. Now, there is another aspect of how you should be dealing with service providers, which is around being supportive and empathetic to what their reality is. Hence, do not expect a global action plan, which is already ready and ready to be rolled out all across where they work. This is a fast evolving environment for them too. And some of the challenges that they face from their supply perspective are a function of where they operate from, local regulations, industry standards, and even the kind of contracts that they have signed with you. But then, on the other hand, there are some situations which are of their own making, like the example that I was citing earlier around their inability to move swiftly to a remote work model, which has happened largely because a large share of service providers employees based out of the largest service location, that is India, operate on desktops. The typical policy has been to give the laptops to managers and above only, and that has created a unique procurement situation for them, wherein they are currently trying to ensure that they get those devices, laptops, onto employees who have been mandated to work from home. And this is indeed a huge, huge crisis that they're trying to solve for. Now, there is a big wide spectrum out there. Not all service providers are the same. There are some who are much more prepared, had anticipated, not really the pandemic of this magnitude, but ensuring that they were testing out remote working models right from the very beginning. They are probably safer. Hence, in your portfolio, you need to be running those checks as regards how prepared your service provider is in managing some of these situations. Last but not the least, you have to manage risks and liabilities. And what you see in front of you on this particular slide is not something which is rocket science. You probably are already aware of the boxes that you need to check in order to ensure that service providers are maintaining the service continuity that you have signed up for. But essentially, these are four most important aspects that you should be running a check on. Things which are fundamental: ensuring the health and safety of employees and contractors, ensuring operational certainty by checking on IT preparedness, having that virtual desktop infrastructure which allows you to be connected, working from wherever you are, and then having those mitigation plans, which by accounts, by industries, by locations where they operate out of, in your situation, they are coming up with those plans. Last but not the least is the messaging aspect. The point that I would like to make here is that the relationships do not happen between organizations. They happen between people. And folks who are fronting a service provider organization for you, their senior executives, how they are communicating, what they are committing is going to be really very important in comforting you of the level of certainty that you need around service continuity. So that's the point that I wanted to make around the triaging aspect with service providers.
Well, thanks for that. I love that phrase you used at the beginning of your piece there about planning on your feet, and the slide that we've got up on the screen with those 4 aspects will be really helpful, I think, for listeners when they're thinking about their own outsourced services and what they might be able to do in terms of the service providers. Let's bring you back in now, Amy. How do we triage our procurement teams then? We've talked about service providers. What about the procurement team?
Thanks. So as I mentioned earlier, and we've all probably seen this on social media for those of us that are online, procurement is really being called to, for some of us, called to the table in a way that we haven't been in the past. So I view this as a huge opportunity to get through the crisis in the immediate, but also to come out ahead later on and to help our organizations and business stakeholders. The first priority for many people is immediate health, safety, and remote work needs, and sourcing and buying that. I mentioned I have friends who are in food factories, food providers, manufacturers, and they're looking for face masks so they can keep their lines running. There are others that are looking for, Abhishek talked about laptops. We've got CEO to CEO conversations with these providers to get the laptops they need. If your office suddenly started working remotely, you may be, sourcing headsets and other types of technology, and quite a few Bay Area companies are helping to compensate their teams for various tools and things. So for many people, there's been a real triage just around buying things that maybe weren't even on their roadmap before. And we all know, as procurement people, we don't like to have to go out and source something in a day's notice. That's not our ideal level of agility. I think the next thing really is about the immediate assessment of the supply base. When I talk to some of our SOVM members, we have people tell me, well, I just spent the last 2 weeks going through BCP plans for all of our suppliers to understand, where our terms are on various factors, T's and C's, flexibility, what's in the contract. And what we're finding is a lot of what we need to do is charting new territory, not necessarily what's in the contract. Thinking about kind of the make versus buy and shifting internal and external operations. So, we talk a lot about make versus buy models in other areas of procurement. I think many people don't think about it in services as, do I do this in-house or do I have my provider do it? And in this case, how do I even shift around different providers and locations and internal and external? And with some of the details Abhishek just shared, I think we all need to think about that in the next few weeks and months about where some of those shifts are possible and what the different balance is as different countries get hit at different times. Another thing I think that's really important, and he alluded to this, is just being flexible with provider solutions. We've heard from a few providers that, they may not, their MSA with their buyer may not allow for remote work. We need to, as procurement people, listen to our suppliers and start to understand where are the best ways for them to adapt and loosen up a little bit. So you see a lot of exceptions to MSAs happening to allow them to get along. And from what I'm hearing, different companies, different, purchasing organizations or procurement organizations are more flexible, faster. So, and something to think about, I think the next point here also gets to the fact that we're dealing with people here. Organizations are run by people, and relationships are really important right now. You do need to be thinking about what kinds of projects you have in place, right, or in process. So if you were doing a big RFP, a month ago, and you have contracts that are coming up and you were looking to switch, we've got to really think about, is now the right time to switch a supplier in one of these strategic areas? We know that relationships are important, and new remote relationships add a whole layer of friction and learning curve. We want to leverage the goodwill we have. That doesn't mean that you award a 10-year contract or a 5-year contract to an incumbent that's underperforming, but what it may mean is that we need to be putting in place some 6-month extensions to a contract before we go out to market again, just so we can keep things a little stable and use that goodwill in the near term as we give our suppliers a chance to step up. One heartwarming thing that I saw when we were talking to providers is that they really have come together and shared best practices even among competitors, and I suspect that's happening in a lot of supply-based, niches and markets out there, that we need to give them a chance to bring their best ideas and respect the relationships. And this is one of those times when you really know who your true partners were and who you were in a transactional relationship with. The last thing I would add on here is shoring up short-term costs, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we move into the next kind of idea of moving forward and looking at next steps. But in the very near term, you should, if you haven't already done this in the recent past, you should be looking at things like your staffing and your rates and your service levels for your third-party partners. Understand if you have overscoping or if you have the right skill role mix, and understand the market pricing. We do quite a bit of price benchmarking, and we see huge gaps in terms of contract terms and pricing and rates for different skills that are really in favor of the providers. You want to be kind of identifying that fat and having, I hate to use the term, but the low-hanging fruit right now before we get deeper into financial troubles. If you feel like you're above market and you have data to show that, make sure you're asking for discounts. Now is the time to be, pushing back on anything you can to tighten up your spend. And then I would kind of wrap that up with just saying, be wary of any long-term commitments right now. Our focus in the very immediate term needs to be flexibility and agility. We shouldn't be putting in place anything that's going to lock us in over the next 6 months or even longer.
Yeah, I think you're right. Some of it's about trying to get that balance of risk, isn't it? You talked about the time to switch and the risk about that, the make or buy conversation again. Where's the risk sitting there, and what risk are we trying to manage, and perhaps trying to take that deep breath, flex those procurement skills that perhaps we haven't used for a while, that we need to use now because we've had particular relationships in place. So some great tips there, really, Amy. But saying actually, we've got, back to Michael's curve, we've got this cycle that we're going through, and actually as we start to come out of that, putting something long term in when we're at the bottom of that cycle isn't necessarily the best outcome for our organisation. So that thing about just trying to shore things up as well, really good advice there. And I think that moves me very nicely then into the next phase of our webinar, which is to talk about the future and to talk about where we're going in terms of moving into recovery and through to that back to work phase, and starting to think then about what we should be preparing for. And Abhishek, I'd like to go back to you then to talk about service providers again. What would you like to talk about here in terms of starting that move forward again?
Sure. What we have seen till now, the last 7 or 8 days, is that service providers have really been exposed to what is called the worst case scenario. I know business continuity plans exist by the plenty, but it's seldom that they get activated in the manner that we have seen these getting activated in the last few days. And this is what service providers will be forced to work upon as they prepare for future. When things normalize, the different kind of scenarios that they use to plan for, I think that thinking itself has gotten stretched to an extent that the lot of effort that they will be putting on, and this is what this slide actually focuses on, as they think through when they come to the new normal, as they think of future from a business continuity planning perspective. These are the 3 elements that they should be actually thinking about. And on the right-hand side, you actually see the financial impact of it, which we are currently in the midst of, how to anticipate that, how to prepare for that. I think all of that will get activated when we come to the new normal. I think of the current situation in an analogous manner to something like a fire extinguisher that sits in our house. Cobwebs start building on it. We don't really know whether it works or not. And we have a false sense of security around something that will keep us safe. And that is the situation with the current business continuity plans that exist. And we have seen examples of that while we were discussing how service providers were managing things. And I think that is what is going to change in the future.
So we're going to get that. We're definitely going to have our fire extinguisher dusted and ready for action there. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the slide as well, Abhishek, in terms of this 10-year risk-adjusted cost of mitigation that you've got in there. What are you thinking in that context? Is that where we start to look a bit longer term?
Oh, absolutely, because when we are talking of mitigation, it has to be quantified. And the more quantifiable business continuity plans are, the more effective they will be. And that is why scenario planning cannot be like hand waving, that we are talking about esoteric concepts. They have to be quantified into numbers, into impact elements, and cost is a very, very major part of it.
Okay, and I think, that will be one of the things that we're a lot better at as we come out of this, will be that planning and that ability to quantify and cost things. What about procurement then, Amy? What can we think about as, again, we move into the recovery and the back to work phases of Michael's graph?
Sure. So, I talked a little bit about what procurement is doing now, and as I look at where we need to be coming out of this, I think we really should be, some of the things I'm going to talk about, we really should be thinking about right now and studying up on and doing our homework so that whether we end up in a recession, which is looking pretty likely here in the US, and I suspect other parts of the world, or we just are shut down for a while, eventually when we come up, we're better positioned to support our stakeholders. The number one thing that I'm going to say is stay close to your stakeholders. I hope we all know that by now. I think the Procurious group, members are pretty strategic thinking, but the number one thing we should be doing is listening to the business owners who are spending money and understand what value they need and what their priorities are. Their priorities have inevitably shifted, so how does that change what we need to be doing? The first thing that I see coming out of this is that we're going to have a focus on cost cutting. Again, unfortunately, a lot of businesses are going to be in a difficult financial situation. We know that when we came out of the 2008-2009 crisis in the U.S., we saw procurement savings numbers just incredibly high for the next few years following that, because we were able to go out and negotiate with a sense of power with our suppliers. I see something similar happening. I'm a little bit apprehensive about this because we've tried for the last 10 years to become focused on higher value and not just savings. But we know that the bottom line is we have to help with, manage the spend and the supply base of our organizations. So think about how you're going to deal with those cost-cutting pressures. How can you enable them? It's better to cut external costs than it is to have to cut headcount, right? So we can step up here from a demand management perspective. What did we live without that maybe we can take out of our specs and going forward, or shift our spend away from? I mentioned price benchmarking before. I think there's all kinds of benchmarking that can be really beneficial. We should not be above market pricing, especially if market pricing is decreasing. We need to be revisiting our agreements. So if we have long-term contracts that are in place for, we're built in a different era, we need to go back and open those up for negotiation. What parts of that can we adjust to both parties' benefit? We also need to think about what categories maybe did we not have permission in before that we can get into now. We all know that procurement, very few procurement organizations have 100% of their spend under their influence or some level of control. And often it takes some kind of internal management leadership change or an external kind of inflection point to change the status of procurement and to give us an entree into those categories. I would look for those opportunities. I would make sure that you're looking for the areas in your business that need cost savings help or supplier management help, and making yourself available to that, as hard as it is, because we're all stretched and homeschooling our kids at the same time as working from home. Now is the time to be available and to look for those big opportunities that can add value to the business. The second thing I want to talk about is risk, and Abhishek talked a lot about business continuity plans and how those will change. Procurement for a long time now has been considering risk for both supplier risk, supply-based risk, supply chain risk, all of those as part of our responsibility. We used to say, you can't mitigate yourself to 0% risk, right? It's impossible without an infinite budget to mitigate all risk. Well, I feel like that's kind of come back in our face, on my face, forever saying that, because this was one of those risks that we never planned for and we didn't try to mitigate, and here we are. So there's kind of this balance between the cost and the risk, and we're going to have to rethink that. Not that we're going to get to ever 100%, but how do we balance that? We're also going to have to think about supplier financial risk. That is likely to be a real challenge, as it was in the 2009 timeframe. And if we have, hopefully most organizations have been monitoring their suppliers and kind of might know who's at risk, but go back and take a look at that. Which industries, which companies, which balance sheets are starting to look a little questionable? Do you have tools that you can turn on? So if you have supply chain financing tools in your source to pay platform or in some of the technology you're using, now is the time to make sure those are available to your suppliers, right? It could make the difference between them serving you or failing. This is maybe less relevant because I think the big service providers are mostly in a different place, but I think it's really important to think of that throughout your supply base. Where can you help with, making sure you're paying on time, things like that. There's a lot that can be done in the financial supply chain to help out right now if we can. Certainly business continuity and disaster recovery plans. As we look at those, we have a lot of, we definitely have a role to play in looking at supply-based risk and thinking about, say the balance of locations. I mean, when we think about the trade-off of risk versus volume leverage, right? A lot of what we've done is try to aggregate volume to save money. Well, we just talked about how aggregating that volume can kind of put you in trouble. So where are the trade-offs? What are we willing to give? And I think as we look at those BCP plans, there's going to be new questions to grapple with, and we're really going to think of our approach maybe a little differently depending on the company. I would also say that we need to think about market intelligence sources and technologies that help us to better monitor supplier risk and mitigate risk. So there's a lot of great tools out there. I've watched for the last several years as the cloud-based risk management tools have really grown and started using, integrated machine learning and AI. If you don't have those tools, you may have the platform now to invest in that, and that may be something you want sooner rather than later. It makes sense to be investing in things like good risk market intelligence and good technology around this in the near term. And I think we'll have the story to build the business case a bit better in the future. The last thing is agility. I mentioned kind of taking a new view around, volume versus risk leverage. I think how we look at our supply base may change as well. We need to think about, which suppliers, looking at the performance, the flexibility, geographic differentiation. Do we have agreements that can scale up or scale down? In a situation like this, like I was mentioning in the last slide, are we able to shift our volume or shift our work in the ways that we need to deal with, one city down type situation, or a black swan event here that like this one that hurts and affects so many different cities. So, thinking about the supply base as a whole, our perspective and our strategy is definitely going to change here. We also need to think about our workforce. So whether that be our procurement workforce or our broader, contingent and full-time workforce, we're probably going to have greater allowances for remote work. And I think we may be thinking a lot more about increased automation where we have less reliance on human tasks. That's been happening for a long time. That's not new, but, I can certainly see a lot of situations where things that could have been done, by RPA are still being done by people who need to be in an office. And, there may be some growth in robotics and machine learning type technologies coming out of this as well. So I am optimistic that a lot of these things can help us to pivot and and build up our case for things that we've been wanting to do for a while. But it's going to be a rocky road for the next weeks, months, however long it takes us to get out of this.
And I think what you were saying there at the beginning of your piece about the cost. When we get to the point where we're not looking for suppliers and contingency plans, and we've got a little bit of time between homeschooling the kids and doing the stuff at home, getting a deep dive into that whole area of cost and thinking about demand and the price and so on is some good prep work we can do to get ready for when we're in the position where we can start to think about really getting that value back out of the contracts again. So some really good practical tips there, Amy. Thank you for that. Michael, you've not been with us for a while, contributing. Before we close, let's come back to you. And I believe you've developed some provocations to share with our listeners today. A bit of a phrase that I've not heard that one before, but provocations then. Let's start with those and see what you've got to say about them. What are they?
Yeah, so as we close this out, the first thing we'd ask you to think about is drifting the curve. And drifting the curve is really a racing phraseology, really, where we have two options available to us. One is we can push hard on the brakes, or we can power through the curve. And for those organizations, there could be a tendency to hit the brakes hard, stop the organization, or for those that are going to eventually succeed on the other side of this crisis, they're going to be powering through that curve, and they're going to be accelerating out of the curve. They're going to have their plans in place, and they're going to have their stakeholders lined up with what do we need to do, what do we learn, what do we need to do. The second part here is to get through this crisis with as little pain as possible. And so we know there's going to be pain. We know there's going to be change. As Abhishek and Amy have been taking us through here, good partners with your supply chain, understanding what's happening in the marketplace. Those are all going to be critical components of what happens. But you're going to be judged as leaders not on the dip, but on the recovery. So I think everybody's going to look back and say, okay, we all experienced some real challenges over the past 3 or 4 months. Hopefully it's in that kind of maybe even shorter than that, but let's call it 3 or 4 months. But the real leaders are going to be, what do they do in the following 6 months? And what do we learn? The third provocation we hear is, use this productively. And the appetite for creating tremendous opportunity on the outside. So using transformation, looking at this and saying we can be better. And that's one of the things I had one of the first slides there was we will have a new normal, and there will be an opportunity for organizations to do things they've never done before. We're going to need some cost savings, as Amy was talking about, but there's going to be some opportunities there to really look at. We didn't need to be doing these things. I think there's going to be times when people go back to the office and say, we haven't done that for 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Do we need to be doing it at all? Or do we find a better way to do it in a crisis moment? So, using this as an opportunity for process improvement is going to be extremely important. And then finally, I think it's all about not losing sight of the future. I think that's really, really important here. Appreciating what we have as both professionally and as individuals and families. I think there's going to be a shift in how we view the workplace. So for me, I've been working out of my home office for 20 plus years. For some, that's a new experience. And so I think, in the expectations, I think if I was worried about anything right now, all these large campuses and office buildings, I think there's going to be a whole new way we view those as assets or liabilities down the road. And we'll see how that works out. But I think we're going to have to think about how the workplace comes together, both socially as well as, from our processes and the real estate involved. Also, say be enthusiastic about building something better. I think we all want to do that. And so I think that's important. And then finally, keep your eye on the ball. There has been an ongoing, digital and modernization strategies, and this is just another excuse to accelerate those.
Excellent, and I love that idea of powering out of the corner. I like my motorsport, so I like the thought of getting on the throttle early and getting ahead, and also that theme that's been running through, I think, which is about using the time productively, and there's lots that we can be doing right now. Right, we're coming to the end of the webinar now. What's one thing you're going to do differently, both professionally and personally, when you come out of this crisis? Amy, let's start with you.
Yeah, this is a tough one because I feel like we're probably kind of early into it. So I've worked from home for about 10 years as well, most of the time. I do miss my travel. I do appreciate my face-to-face time quite a bit. I'll likely appreciate it more. But one thing that I've noticed is that the dynamic of working from home has changed quite a bit in the last 2 weeks. First of all, everyone else is at home, so there's sort of a more casual vibe to it all. And now everyone wants to use video. I used video occasionally before, but not that much. Now it's almost like I feel like I have to be on top of things and keeping my office clean and well-groomed, where it didn't matter as much before. So, there's a little bit of shift. Yeah. And I also, I, like many, have kids that are doing online learning from home. So there's a little bit more of blending of work time and personal time. I'm not quite sure where that's all going to level out when we get past, the school year and probably the summer and get them back into school. But I do feel like the way I work from home is probably going to shift a little bit, and the way we interact internally and with our clients will shift a bit as well. Not quite sure what that'll look like, but it feels very different than it did 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are some of the conversations that we've been having within the COVID-19 group on Procurious, is about home working and about different styles of working and interacting. So, yeah, absolutely. What about you, Michael?
So professionally, I look at the need to cultivate your networks and the people that we're reaching out to, those that are going to be there to help us, and those that we can help and serve. I think that's extremely important. It's always been important, but I think it becomes even more critical as we think about where this takes us down the road. Personally, my wife and I got a travel trailer 2 years ago, and we have a absolute fanaticism about going to see the rest of America. So I've done a lot of travel globally, and I've seen a lot of the big cities, but there is a tremendous, beautiful part of the U.S. that we haven't quite uncovered, and so we're going to be taken to the road over the next couple of years.
Brilliant. That sounds absolutely fantastic. Good to get out and travel. What about you, Abhishek? What about your things that you're going to do differently?
I think a lot. If I think back 2 weeks from now, 80% of my waking time was either in travel, doing office work. And if I look back, the time that I spent with my family, folks around me, it was becoming more and more transactional. Now, when I'm logged in with them for the past 2 weeks, I think that level of interaction, appreciation for each other has much more increased. And I think I'll continue to value that. And I think personally, a lot will change within family as to how much we appreciate each other, and even at work. Professionally, I would say when it comes to adoption of technology, I was not really an early adopter of technology. I consider myself as a fast follower. And what I have realized during these last 14 days is the fact that all those pieces of technology that I was using earlier, I had gotten really used to, stood me in good stead. They really helped me wade through the situation that we are in. I won't say helped me, I'm still helping me because we are still in that situation. I think what will change about me professionally is that I'll look at technology more as an early adopter. Probably I'll be looking at all those new gadgets, new tools that are coming out, and I'll be experimenting more with those.
Okay, so we might see you on TikTok very soon then, if you're going to be an early adopter.
I can't wait to see that.
Right, okay, well, thanks so much to our guests today. That's the end of our webinar on how to triage your outsourced services. And thank you again to the executive team from Everest Group. Our experts have provided a fantastic overview of the global context or chaos in which we're all trying to operate. And there's been some really excellent practical advice for this category and how best to manage it, and some great slides as well on the webinar that our listeners can have a look at again afterwards. So if you'd like to listen to the webinar again or share it with your peers, we'll be making the on-demand version available in the COVID-19 group on Procurious from tomorrow. And remember, we're trying to crowdsource confidence during this crisis. So if you need support, please ask a question on the Procurious discussion forum to keep the debate going. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen in.